In our discussion of business cycles, we've been talking about something called GDP. And I gave you the definition quickly last time. But gross domestic product is defined as the monetary value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. Now, there are two important phrases in that definition. First is final goods and services. When we calculate GDP, we're only calculating the final goods, the goods that get sold in the product market. The reason for that is because we don't want to double count. We don't want to count things that get used as inputs into production and then count the final good. And so we're counting that same good twice. The second important phrase in that definition is monetary value. We have to use monetary value because it's the only way we can add things up. How do you add an apple to an orange to a car tire to a baseball? You can't do it. There's just no way. So we add up, excuse me, the monetary values. And that's what we're seeing here in this equation. GDP equals the price of the first good, let's say an apple. So the price of an apple times the number of apples produced last year. And we add that gives us the monetary value. The price times the quantity gives us a dollar value of apples. All right. So price of a second good, let's say oranges. So the price of oranges times the number of oranges. And we do that, we get the monetary value of the output of each good from the first one to the X good. And that gives us our GDP. This equation here can be summed up in this rather ugly looking thing. For those of you who like mathematical equations, this is not a problem for you. For those of you who don't like mathematical equations, don't let it throw you. All this equation is saying is from the add up from the first good to the last good, the price times the quantity. So these two are saying the same thing. I threw this in here because it shows it to you in the textbook, and I just didn't want you to freak out about it. Okay, so let's look at how we calculate GDP. Okay, so what we're seeing here are the components of GDP. The components of GDP are made up of consumption, investment, government spending, and X minus M is net exports. Now let's look at these individually. Consumption is what consumers do. It's the purchases that you and I make. When we look at consumption, we usually break them up into two categories: durable goods and non-durable goods. Durable goods are goods that have a life expectancy of more than 3 years. So you think of your car, your home, maybe your computer. Those things that you're going to buy, and you don't buy them very frequently. And usually because of their expense, we try to be very careful when we purchase them. For example, you're not going to go out and buy a new car if you're afraid you're going to lose your job next week, right? So we assume that consumers are confident about the economy if they're going out and purchasing durable goods. Now, non-durable goods are goods that have a life expectancy of less than 3 years. They don't always have to be expensive. They probably, you're talking food, clothing, things like that. So we normally don't hear about non-durable goods orders. We usually only hear about durable goods. Now, the next thing we see is investment. Now, it's very important that you understand that investment is business spending. It is everything that businesses spend money on. Right? This definition is very different than what an accountant or a financial person would give you for investment. All right, so just be careful about that. And G stands for government spending. Government spending includes everything the government spends money on, with one very large exception, and those are transfer payments. Transfer payments are payments for which no good or service is received at the time. For example, Social Security payments are transfer payments. By Social Security as a transfer payment, what we're looking at is you're working now, you're producing a good now, it gets included in the GDP of this year. You get Social Security 30 years from now, you're finally getting the money that you worked for 30 years previously. So there's a disconnect between the time you provide a good or service and the time you get the money. Again, we're worried about double counting. We don't want to count the money or the good twice, so we don't include transfer payments in GDP. The final component of GDP is net exports. That's the X minus M. And net exports is simply a difference between our exports and our imports. And towards the end of the semester, when we look at the international economy, we will look at that. Now, when we're looking at GDP, it's very important to understand what measure of GDP we're looking at. There are two measures of GDP that get used. One of them is what we call nominal or current dollar GDP. Current dollar GDP, nominal GDP, is GDP calculated using the prices and the quantities of the same year. So if you wanted to calculate GDP for 2017, you would use the prices in 2017 and you multiply them by the quantities in 2017. But there's a problem with using nominal GDP. If we tried to compare nominal GDP from the year 2017 and nominal GDP for the year 2018, if 2018 is larger than 2017, can we rightfully conclude that output went up, that we produced more goods? Well, the answer is no, because prices could have changed. If prices went up and output dropped, GDP could still go up. So we had to find a way to use GDP as a measure of changes in output and the health of the economy without worrying about changes in prices. So we've come up with what we call real GDP or constant dollar GDP. Now, anytime in economics that you hear the word real, that indicates that somehow, some way, this number has been adjusted for something. All right. In the case of real GDP, what we've done is we've corrected for inflation. In this case, what we're doing is we're taking the quantities of 2018, but we multiply it by the price of the good in what we call a base year. It's a year we compare everything against. So let's say 2010 is our base year. So to calculate real GDP for 2018, we take the quantities that were produced or sold in 2018 and we multiply them by prices of the goods in 2010. Now, when we come up with the base year, the government goes back and it calculates all GDPs using the prices of that base year and multiplying by the quantities. All right, so this way you can compare GDPs from one year to another. All right, and be certain that the changes in GDP are due to changes in output, not to changes in prices. Now, there's another way of calculating real GDP, and that would be to take the nominal GDP, divide by a deflator, which is just a statistic that compares prices from one year to another. But let's not worry about that right now. What I need you to understand is the importance of GDP in looking at business cycles. GDP measures our output. We want GDP to constantly be increasing. We want to have more stuff. And so we use this statistic to measure the health of the economy. Now, please understand, GDP is not a magic number. It's not a perfect number. Our calculations of GDP only include legally transacted goods. So anything that's in the black market, anything that's being illegally transacted does not make it into GDP. If you barter, for example, if you exchange a good for a good, my brother used to be a student at RV, and he would have papers he needed typed. I would type his papers for him, and while I typed his papers, he would change the oil in my car. Right? So here's two services, typing and oil change, that don't make it into the market. They're being exchanged. Now, if they don't get into the market, they don't get included in GDP. So please don't think that it's only illegally transacted goods. They don't necessarily make it into GDP. So GDP is an important measure of the health of the economy, but please understand it's not perfect. But for those of you who took statistics, you realize that if you make the same error in calculations year after year after year, then that error doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't skew your results. There's no bias, really. And so that's what we've kind of settled with GDP. We realize it's not a perfect measure of output, but it's the best we can do. Okay. Talk to you soon.